Hi, my name is Tim McNally. I am the founder of Communication Strategies Company. In this presentation, I will be discussing two theories primarily, the framing theory by Fairhurst and the social presence theory as discussed by Gunawardena, Short, William, and Christie, and also Lindgren. So the social presence theory discusses salience and perception. It also touches on intimacy and immediacy, an aspect of realness and being able to relate to one's audience. The framing theory talks about speaking the language of the audience, being able to relate to the audience, but more specifically, creating the reality of any situation for the audience, shaping the perspective that the audience has of any situation. And Fairhurst uses three paradigms or aspects of leadership communication to discuss this. She uses timing, task, and seeming trivialities. So we will talk about these in more depth throughout this presentation. The hive effect, in my original analysis, I thought that the hive effect applied to digital media communicators. However, after further consideration, I no longer hold that perception, that belief, because I believe that the hive effect is more along the lines of societies that are to themselves and not open-minded. And I believe that digital media communicators, especially the ones that I interviewed for this specific analysis, are very open, and the hive effect does not apply to them. However, I left it in this slide and throughout the presentation just so that I can touch back on that aspect. So the social presence theory. In Lindgren's 2017 work, he talks about awareness of an interaction partner as part of the social presence theory. Now, the social presence theory is originally discovered by Short, William, and Christie. They discuss the social presence theory in relation to telecommunication regarding radio and television and the interaction between the audience and the communicators in those arenas. So there's an element of awareness of the communicator's awareness of his or her audience. There's also the element of interaction and how the interaction is purveyed, how it's received, how the message is received by the audience, how it's sent by the communicator, the sender of the message. And then there's also the audience's perception, and that ties to Fairhurst's framing theory, which we'll get into furthermore in this presentation. Also in the social presence theory, Short discusses the element of immediacy. And Short describes immediacy as physical proximity from the communicator, the sender of the message, to the audience or the message receiver. And along with this is intimacy. And so those are two very closely tied elements of this theory and also the framing theory that I will discuss in more depth as we continue through this presentation. So as I mentioned in the beginning, I base my analysis on the framing theory and the social presence theory. And I use two interviews that I conducted with two professional media content creators. The first interview was with Troy MAIRS of Kairos Film Co. And a few highlights from this interview include Troy's purpose and mission as a content creator. He works with other businesses to create a brand or represent a company through his digital media content. He helps companies develop their brand and then promote the brand. This will tie back to the framing concept or theory that I mentioned at the beginning by Fairhurst, in that it influences or leads the audience in a perception that Troy, as the content creator, wants them to have. In Troy's words, digital media is, quote, a canvas to create on, end quote. He described it as something similar to an artist or photographer as they are creative in their work, or even a musician as they create, so he does with his cinematography. Troy desires to help others share their story, and in his words, make stuff look cool. Some further highlights of our interview. Troy shared with me that he creates to evoke feelings for his target audience. So part of that framing and the social presence theory of intimacy and immediacy is understanding the audience, the target audience, and creating content that is going to speak the audience's language and keep their interest and speak to them in such a way that they understand what it is the content creator is trying to purvey, and be relatable and personal with the audience so that they can connect and relate with the communicator. Troy advocates for not being anonymous in any way, but being unique and vulnerable. Not in any way that would endanger him or his family, but in most aspects of his character, he believes in being vulnerable with his audience so that they can more easily relate with him. Troy's filming company, Kairos Films, I wanted to focus for a moment on the word kairos, because the word kairos comes from the Greek language, and it is roughly interpreted to mean seizing the moment and taking action. And so I thought that that was a very interesting word that went along with the presentation today and the theories that we were discussing. And then lastly, Troy's passion is to inspire others through the content that he creates and inspire them to action. As the word kairos states, seizing the moment and taking action, Troy aspires to inspire others to take action. Now to apply some of our concepts and theories. So the Fairhurst framing perspective. She talks about timing, task, and seeming trivialities. And in Troy's interview, he discusses framing the perspective of his audience. In one part of our interview, he even talked about taking something that seemed ordinary and mundane and showing it in the perspective that the audience may have never seen before. And that's one of the things that he enjoys about creating digital media content. And so in doing this, he is shaping the view of the audience. He's controlling, to some extent, influencing their perception of any certain thing on the screen that they're looking at. So Troy creates film. He's a cinematographer. In creating the film, he's able to show it through the lens of the camera at any angle from any point of view, higher, lower, from an angle to the side. And he's able to put audio and music, visual effects, and apply those to his media content. And in doing all of that, he is framing, leading, and influencing his viewers. Elements of time, task, and seeming trivialities, I'll tie in with that. The element of timing, as Fairhurst describes, showing the right effect at the right moment inside the media. The task itself of what he's trying to do and the concept or message he's trying to send. And then the seeming trivialities, which are things that are small, maybe seemingly insignificant opportunities that Troy has that are just part of that process of communication, and maybe specific to cinematography itself, when applying this theory to a specific type of communication. The seeming triviality might be specific to that specific type of communication. For in this example, it would be film. Moving on to Short, William and Christie's social presence theory. As I mentioned, they began discovering the social presence theory in the 1760s, when they published their first, the text that I referenced, I should say, for this research. And they focus on salience during the interaction, which is largely the proximity and how much the physical distance, if you will, of the audience to the communicator. And so by controlling the distance between the communicator and the audience, the communicator has ability to seem more or less accessible or relatable to the audience. For example, when I become closer, perhaps I seem to be invading space, or perhaps I seem to be more accessible, more relatable. Perhaps I'm sharing something with you that it's as if I were telling you a secret. Whereas if I were to move away, I might seem more distant, more aloof, and not as relatable. This also ties in with the language and formality of dress that a communicator uses in their presentation. It also ties in with the formality of language that a presenter uses in their communication. Gunawardena, in her 1995 social presence theory text, talks about being perceived as a real person. So Troy, in his interview, talks about this this perception of being perceived as a real person, and that's one of the reasons why he doesn't choose complete anonymity in his content creation, but the uniqueness and vulnerability. So that way, his audience can relate to him, and he can be perceived as a real person. Just like, for example, we were to say, "Oh, he's just like you and me. He's a real person." So there's that element of relatability, that element of seeming real. And then, of course, the hive effect, as I mentioned earlier, I thought that this would apply to Troy, because one of the things I noticed about Troy and the next interviewee that I talked with is that they mentioned some of the same concepts in influence and leadership, and it seemed almost to the extent of, it's fascinating how many similarities there were. However, I realized that this was far off, that I was out of line, more or less, in that digital media creators aren't in any way a hive, unless they are in a special interest group, perhaps, as digital media creators. For example, an example of this can be seen in the HANEKE meme that was popular in online, the 4chan forum. Many of the original users of 4chan used the PayPay meme, and it would almost seem that it was there were instances of the hive effect, where there was somewhat of a groupthink and just groups that latched onto the PayPay meme and used it to promote their specific entity or what have you. And that's not the case at all in general with digital media content creators. So I wanted to give a little insight and be vulnerable so that I could be relatable to you as my audience in how I created this analysis and some of my thoughts and the process of my thought in creating this presentation. Next, I'll talk about my interview with David Haneke. He's a film producer with Opening Moments Media Corporation. Some highlights from my interview with David. He is a documentary filmmaker and producer of corporate media. So he described to me that his role in creating media on the documentary side is what you would think about as documentaries. He's worked across different nations of the world, creating documentaries about people, people groups, different cultures, lifestyles, and then sharing that, in his words, to convey empathy. He used the word to put others in the shoes of those whom he is documenting. He wants to make their lives more relatable to the viewers. And so, as a content creator, when we think of social media content creators, oftentimes, such as like what Troy does, he creates media to represent or market others. And he does this oftentimes on social media networks. However, in David's case, he is a media content creator, and he uses his media, digital media content, to help others understand those who may not have the opportunity to express themselves through digital media content. And so he creates documentaries. In one part of our interview, David discusses his perspective of digital media, and I asked him how he would describe it. David has more than 20 years of experience creating media, and so his role in creating digital media has his perspective of it has changed over the years. So he spoke of digital media now as being easily created, easily edited, and shared. David told me about how he used to work with rolls of film, and he used to have to splice the film, cut and splice the film on the roll, and how now it's so much easier using a computer and digital media tools and equipment to create and produce these films. To discuss some further highlights, David talked about using content to change others' perspective, which we talked about a little bit earlier. And then I'll mention now he also produces digital media for corporate businesses. And in doing that, he creates marketing or videos, films for boardroom meetings. And his purpose in doing that is to bring everyone that is in that meeting and put them in the same mindset. And so if there's a message that the president of a corporation is trying to convey to board members, David will work with that president to understand what it is they are trying to say, what the message they're trying to convey, and put that in the form of digital media so that it can be conveyed in a more rich form. And he can use he can use pieces of documentaries if he wants to, or he can use visual effects, music, and different things to draw people in and bring them to the same mental space. So David, when he creates this content for corporate businesses, he's creating content for specific audiences. He knows exactly who will see the content. And so he can use that information to help him create content that will be even more specifically able to engage and influence those to whom he is communicating. In David's work, he described to me that he is more interested in client anonymity than he is in his personal anonymity. As a film producer and director, he has worked with individuals that, in his documentaries, that have sensitive situations in which, if they were shared publicly, could put those individuals in danger. So he's concerned more so with his client's anonymity than with his own. He says, as a producer and director, his anonymity is not too much of a concern. David's purpose, in his words, in creating his digital media content is to cause others to rise and take positive action. So I believe that applies not only to the documentaries, especially to the documentaries, but not only to that, but also to the corporate media, because in creating the content that he does, he is helping those in the meeting, the corporate meeting setting, to come together and work together to create, design, make informed decisions. And he gets to be a part of that process. I'll discuss the application of these concepts. So Fairhurst, to apply the framing concept and the framing perspective, many similarities to Troy's media, digital media content. However, in David's case, creating documentaries, creating corporate business meeting content. As I mentioned, David is creating content in the corporate realm with very specific audiences. He knows exactly who he will be creating for. And so he can use, the information to influence directly those individuals. So for example, he could find out from the president of the corporation what it is that the president is trying to convey, and then find out some of the specific interests of those on his board committee. And so if everyone in the room, or a majority of them, are sports fans, he can incorporate digital media into the digital media that he's creating to convey his specific message. He can incorporate sports into that message. Or if everyone is an avid outdoorsman and enjoys spending time in the woods, perhaps fishing, he can incorporate elements of fishing, sounds that might trigger memories or feelings for these individuals. For example, if everyone's a sports fan, he could include the sound of a baseball striking a bat, and that would evoke certain feelings, perhaps for those who have ever attended a baseball game or watched sports on a regular basis. Now, that's just one small example. He can use that to frame the perspectives of those in his audience. With the social presence theory by Short, William, and Christie in their 1976 text, and also with Gunawardena in the 1995 social presence theory text, salience, proximity, being relatable, and being perceived as a real person. Being relatable also includes that aspect of going back to the sports and using that in the corporate office to relate to the audience. For example, the baseball striking the bat. If that is a part of the digital media that's being presented and sharing the message of the president of the corporation, everyone will feel more in touch or more able to relate to that individual, the president. So the leader or president of that boardroom meeting can relate to their audience through that digital media content. And that's what David creates. Similarly with documentaries, documentaries could be on anything in particular, but based on the music that David uses, the visual effects that he uses, and the angles from which he presents the perspective of these individuals in his documentaries can make the audience feel like they relate more or less to those being portrayed in the documentary. So we'll move on from here to the conclusion. And I'll just go over sort of a recap of what we've discussed today in this presentation. So in this presentation, I mentioned the social presence theory by Short, William, and Christie. I also talk about Gunawardena's social presence theory text. And then also, I believe I mentioned Lindgren in his 2019 text that discusses social presence theory. That's not listed here, but I did discuss that. And then I also discussed the framing concepts by Fairhurst in her 2011 text, discussing how through digital media, influencers, content creators are able to lead and affect their audience's perception of reality. And so through the social presence theory of being relatable, being believable, and using that to frame the reality of any given situation, social media, digital media content creators are able to lead their audiences. And so there's an element of power in the position of digital media content creator, and especially if they choose to be social media influencers. And that's one of the main conclusions that I drew from this analysis, is just the power of influence that comes from being a digital media content creator, and how digital media content is a growing form of communication and has been for the last several years. So we also discuss the hive effect. Oh, there's the Lindgren as a reference. But the hive effect by Kine, I wanted to include that because in this presentation and in this analysis, I discussed vulnerability and relatability. And so I wanted to share my process of analyzing these interviews, these theories, and just some of the thoughts that went through my mind. And so while I no longer believe that the hive effect is applicable to what I've discussed today as far as digital media content creators. I don't think that there's a general hive effect at all whatsoever. But I wanted to share that that was something that came up with me because I wanted to have an element of vulnerability and relatability in this presentation, if nothing else for an example to show what it is that I'm talking about as far as being relatable and being vulnerable. So also in this presentation, I discussed the interviews with Troy and David Haneke. So the next slide is a list of references that I used, and these references, these are just a few that I used. If you would like to see an entire list of references that I used for this analysis, I've written a short essay to go along with this that describes in different detail, some of these theories and concepts and how I applied them. But these are all sources that I used. So if you would like more information on reaching out to the digital media content creators that I interviewed for this analysis, you can email me and I could put you in contact with those individuals. My email address is mcnally.s.tim@gmail.com, all lowercase. That's spelled mcnally.s.tim@gmail.com. And again, those are all lowercase letters. I appreciate you joining me for this presentation. I hope you've enjoyed watching, and I hope you join me again next time for another presentation.